The biting wind carried Elizabeth Sullivan's scream across the rolling plains of Wyoming Territory. "You can't do this," she cried, her honey blonde hair whipping around her face as her father's wagon pulled away, leaving her alone on the dusty road leading into Murphy's. The year was 1873, and at 22 years old, Lillian Sullivan found herself cast out by her own family, with nothing but a small carpet bag containing her meager possessions and the clothes on her back. "You've brought shame to this family for the last time." Her father's words still rang in her ears as the wagon disappeared over the horizon. Her crime: refusing to marry the wealthy cattle baron who had offered a handsome sum to her father in exchange for her hand. A man 3 times her age with a reputation for cruelty that extended far beyond the boundaries of their homestead. Tears streamed down her face as she sank to her knees in the dirt. The autumn sun was setting, painting the vast Wyoming sky in hues of orange and purple, but Lillian could find no beauty in it. Night would fall soon, and she had nowhere to go, no one to turn to. Murphy's was still a mile away, and even if she made it there before dark, who would take her in? Her father had made sure the entire town knew of her defiance and ungrateful heart. Lillian wiped her tears with the back of her hand, leaving a streak of dirt across her flushed cheek. She had to move. Staying on the open road as darkness fell was foolish, even dangerous. With trembling legs, she rose to her feet, picked up her carpet bag, and began walking toward town. She'd made it only a quarter mile when the sound of hoofbeats approached from behind. Fear clutched at her heart as she quickened her pace. But the rider was faster, and soon a magnificent chestnut stallion came alongside her, its rider pulling back on the reins to slow the animal. "Miss, are you all right out here alone?" The voice was deep but gentle, with a hint of concern that made Lillian pause. She looked up to see a tall man atop the horse, his face partially shadowed by the brim of his worn cowboy hat. Broad-shouldered and lean, he had the weathered look of a man who spent his days under the sun. But it was his eyes that caught her attention, kind eyes, the color of a summer sky, studying her with genuine concern. "I'm fine," she lied, her voice catching. "Just walking to town." The cowboy glanced at the setting sun, then back at her tear-stained face. "That's a fair distance to be walking this time of evening," he said, swinging down from his horse with practiced ease. "Blake Easton," he introduced himself with a slight tip of his hat. "I run the Silver Creek Ranch just north of Murphy's." Lillian hesitated before responding. "Lillian Sullivan," she finally offered, clutching her carpet bag tighter. "Miss Sullivan," Blake acknowledged with a nod. His gaze moved briefly to the road behind her, then back to her face, taking in her disheveled appearance and reddened eyes. "Pardon my forwardness, but you seem to be in some distress. Can I offer you assistance?" Fresh tears threatened to spill from Lillian's eyes. The kindness in his voice was almost her undoing after the cruelty she'd endured that day. She blinked them back, determined to maintain what little dignity she had left. My family has cast me out," she admitted, the words burning her throat. "I have nowhere to go." Blake's expression darkened, his jaw tightening as he looked again at the empty road. "They left you here, alone." The controlled anger in his voice was evident. Lillian nodded, unable to trust her voice. Blake took a deep breath, then gestured to his horse. "Miss Sullivan, I can't in good conscience leave you here. Let me take you into town. The widow Cooper runs a boarding house. She's a good woman with a kind heart." Lillian glanced at the massive stallion and then at her carpet bag. I have no money for lodging," she admitted, shame coloring her words. Her father had made sure of that, too. Blake studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then, with a decisiveness that spoke of a man accustomed to making quick judgments, he said, "I have a proposition for you. My sister Rachel passed away last winter, leaving my 2 young nieces in my care. I've hired help at the ranch, but the girls need a proper woman's influence. I'd be willing to offer you room and board in exchange for looking after them." Hope flickered in Lillian's chest for the first time that day, but caution quickly followed. "You don't know me, Mr. Easton." "Why would you trust me with your nieces?" A ghost of a smile touched Blake's lips. "I'm a fair judge of character, Miss Sullivan, And I suspect that anyone cast out by their family for refusing to marry against their will is someone with principles worth respecting." Lillian's eyes widened. "How did you know?" "Word travels fast in Murphy's," Blake replied. "And old man Sullivan's been boasting about the deal he struck with Harlan Wade for days, when I saw you alone on this road." He let the sentence trail off, his meaning clear. Lillian's face burned with humiliation. So everyone knew. She stared at the ground, wishing it would open up and swallow her whole. "Miss Sullivan," Blake said softly, causing her to look up again. "They may not want you, but I do. My nieces need someone like you, and from what I can see, you could use a fresh start." The simple words, spoken without pretense or guile, reached into the very core of Lillian's despair and offered a lifeline. She studied his face, searching for any sign of deceit, but found only honesty in his steady gaze. "The girls are 7 and 5, he continued. "Good children, but they've had more than their share of loss. My foreman's wife, Martha, has been helping when she can, but she has her own family to tend to." "I've never been to a ranch," Lillian admitted. She'd grown up in town, her father a shopkeeper before he'd moved the family to a small homestead outside Murphy's 3 years ago. Blake smiled, a genuine smile that transformed his rugged features. "There's always a first time for everything, Miss Sullivan, and Silver Creek is a good place to start." It was madness to consider going with a man she'd just met. Yet there was something about Blake Easton that inspired trust. Perhaps it was the way he'd immediately dismounted rather than looming over her on horseback, or the respectful distance he maintained. Or maybe it was simply that she had no other options. "If you'd prefer, I can still take you to the widow Cooper's," Blake offered, recognizing her hesitation. "No obligation, the decision is yours." Lillian took a deep breath. "I accept your offer, Mr. Easton. I would be grateful for the opportunity to look after your nieces." Relief flashed across Blake's face. "Good, that's good." He moved to his horse, securing her carpet bag behind the saddle. "Can you ride?" he asked, turning back to her. Lillian nodded. She wasn't an experienced horsewoman, but she could stay seated. "Then I'll help you up first," he said, interlacing his fingers to create a stirrup for her foot. With his assistance, Lillian was soon seated atop the massive chestnut. Blake swung up behind her, keeping a respectful distance as he reached around to take the reins. The warmth of his chest against her back was a stark contrast to the cooling evening air, and despite herself, Lillian felt a sense of security in his presence. "It's about an hour's ride to Silver Creek," Blake informed her as they set off at a steady pace. "The girls will likely be asleep by the time we arrive, but Martha will have kept supper warm for us," he amended. As they rode, the last light of day faded from the sky, stars appearing one by one above the vast Wyoming landscape. Lillian felt the tension begin to drain from her body, replaced by a bone-deep weariness. The events of the day had left her emotionally spent, and the gentle rocking motion of the horse was lulling her toward an exhaustion she could no longer fight. "Rest if you need to," Blake's voice rumbled close to her ear. "I won't let you fall." Perhaps it was foolish to trust him so completely, but in that moment, Lillian believed him. She allowed herself to relax against his solid presence, her eyelids growing heavy as the rhythmic hoofbeats carried them through the gathering darkness towards Silver Creek Ranch. The last thing she remembered before drifting into a fitful doze was Blake's arm tightening slightly around her waist as she swayed, keeping his promise to not let her fall. Lillian awoke with a start as the horse's pace changed, transitioning from the steady rhythm of the open trail to a slower walk. Blinking away the disorientation of sleep, she straightened, embarrassed to find she'd been leaning heavily against Blake's chest. "My apologies, Mr. Easton," she murmured, her voice husky with sleep. "No need," he replied, and she could hear the smile in his voice even without seeing his face. "You've had a trying day." Lillian looked around, taking in her surroundings. Ahead, warm golden light spilled from the windows of a sprawling ranch house, illuminating a wide porch that wrapped around at least 2 sides of the structure. Several outbuildings were visible in the moonlight: a large barn, a bunkhouse, and what appeared to be a cookhouse. Unlike many of the hastily constructed homesteads that dotted the Wyoming Territory, Silver Creek Ranch had the solid, established look of a place built to last. "It's beautiful," she said softly, genuinely impressed by the well-maintained property. "My father started it," Blake explained as they approached. "I took over after he passed 7 years ago, been working to make it something he'd be proud of ever since." They rode into the yard where a weathered man with silver-streaked hair emerged from the barn, lantern in hand. "That you, Blake?" he called, raising the light. "It's me, Frank," Blake confirmed, bringing the chestnut to a halt. "We have a guest." Frank approached, his craggy face curious as he lifted the lantern higher to illuminate Lillian. His eyes widened slightly, but to his credit, he made no comment about her unexpected presence. "This is Miss Lillian Sullivan," Blake introduced her. "She'll be staying with us to help with the girls." "Miss Sullivan, this is Frank Thorpe, my foreman and the closest thing I have to family outside my nieces." "Madam," Frank acknowledged with a respectful nod. "Welcome to Silver Creek." "Thank you," Lillian replied, managing a small smile despite her nervousness. Frank turned his attention back to Blake. "Martha's kept your supper warm. The girls went down about an hour ago, though Emma was determined to wait up for you. That little one's stubborn as her uncle." Blake chuckled as he swung down from the saddle, then reached up to help Lillian dismount. His hands were strong and sure at her waist, easing her gently to the ground. For a moment they stood too close before Blake stepped back, clearing his throat. "Frank, would you mind seeing to Thunder?" he asked, retrieving Lillian's carpet bag from behind the saddle. "Course not," the foreman replied, taking the reins. He gave Lillian another nod. "Madam," Blake gestured toward the house. "Shall we?" Lillian followed him up the porch steps, suddenly acutely aware of her disheveled appearance. Her dress was dusty from the road, her hair tangled from the wind. What would Blake's household think of her? As if sensing her thoughts, Blake paused at the door. "The folks at Silver Creek aren't ones to judge hastily, Miss Sullivan. You'll find no unkindness here." His words bolstered her courage, and Lillian straightened her shoulders as they entered the house. The interior was unexpectedly welcoming. The large main room was dominated by a stone fireplace where logs crackled cheerfully. Sturdy, comfortable-looking furniture was arranged to invite conversation, and colorful braided rugs softened the plank flooring. Books lined shelves built into the walls, and several oil lamps cast a warm glow throughout the space. It was the home of someone who valued comfort over ostentation practical, but not without touches of beauty. A plump woman with a kind face appeared from what Lillian assumed was the kitchen, wiping her hands on her apron. Her eyes widened at the sight of Lillian, but like Frank, she controlled her surprise quickly. "Martha," Blake said, "this is Miss Lillian Sullivan. She'll be staying with us to help with the girls." Martha's gaze softened as she took in Lillian's appearance. Whatever she might have heard about the Sullivan daughter, she chose compassion over judgment. "Welcome, Miss Sullivan. You look like you could use a hot meal and some tea. Come along to the kitchen, and we'll get you settled." The kitchen was as warm and inviting as the rest of the house, with a large cookstove radiating heat and the lingering aroma of the evening meal. Martha gestured for Lillian to sit at the substantial oak table while she bustled about, preparing a plate and pouring tea. "The girls are good children," Martha told her as she worked. "Lively, mind you, especially little Sarah, but good-hearted. They've been through much with losing their parents." "Mr. Easton mentioned his sister passed last winter," Lillian ventured carefully. Martha nodded, her expression somber as she placed a plate of stew and biscuits before Lillian. "Rachel and her husband both, influenza, left those poor little ones orphaned. Blake didn't hesitate to bring them here, though a ranch is no easy place to raise young girls alone." "That was kind of him," Lillian murmured, her heart aching for the children who had lost so much. "That's Blake," Martha said simply, as if those two words explained everything. She poured a cup of coffee for Blake, who had remained standing near the doorway. "Now eat, both of you. There's apple pie for after, and then we can show Miss Sullivan to her room." Lillian hadn't realized how hungry she was until she took the first bite of stew. It was rich and flavorful, clearly made by someone who understood comfort food. She ate with as much decorum as she could muster, though her stomach urged her to devour the meal without pause. Blake sat across from her, eating his own meal with the focused efficiency of a man accustomed to hard work and the appetite it generated. Still, she noted that he took the time to compliment Martha's cooking and inquire about the day's events on the ranch. The Hendersons' boy rode over with a message, Martha informed him. They're having a barn raising next Saturday and hope you'll come. Bringing extra hands would be appreciated, they said. Blake nodded. We'll be there. Their place was hit hard by that storm last month. Martha refilled their cups, then turned to Lillian. Now, dear, if you've finished, I'll show you to your room so you can freshen up. I've laid out some towels and soap, and there's hot water ready for washing. Lillian rose gratefully. Thank you, Mrs. Just Martha, dear, Martha Thorpe. Frank's my husband. Thank you, Martha. Your kindness means more than I can say. The older woman's eyes softened. Everyone deserves kindness, Miss Sullivan, especially those who have had little enough of it. Lillian followed Martha through the house to a comfortable bedroom at the back. It was simply furnished but welcoming, with a brass bed covered in a colorful quilt, a small dresser, a washstand with a pitcher and basin, and a rocking chair by the window. This was Rachel's room, Martha explained, pouring hot water from a kettle into the basin. Blake thought it fitting you should have it, being close to the girl's room across the hall. He had me air it out and prepare it while he was fetching you from town. Lillian's brow furrowed in confusion, but he didn't. He found me on the road. He couldn't have known. Martha paused, realization dawning on her face. Oh dear, I've misspoken. Blake rode to town this afternoon on business and must have come upon you on his return. My mistake. But something in Martha's flustered explanation didn't ring true. Had Blake somehow known she would be there? Had he deliberately sought her out? Before she could question further, Martha was continuing her introduction to the room. The girls are just across the hall. Emma's 7, a thoughtful child with her mother's gentle nature. Sarah's 5 and full of energy from sunup to sundown. They'll be eager to meet you in the morning. I look forward to meeting them as well, Lillian said sincerely. Despite her exhaustion and the confusion of her current circumstances, she felt a flutter of anticipation at the thought of the children she would be caring for. Martha showed her where fresh linens were stored in a small chest, explained that the outhouse was accessible through a covered walkway at the back of the house, and pointed out the location of the bathing room where a large copper tub could be filled for proper baths. Blake has had running water piped to the house from the creek, Martha explained proudly. Not many ranches have such amenities. His father was forward-thinking and Blake even more so. Once she had seen to all of Lillian's immediate needs, Martha bid her goodnight, leaving her alone in the quiet room. Lillian sank onto the edge of the bed, overwhelmed by the day's events. She had woken that morning in her family home, secure in her place in the world despite her father's increasing pressure to accept Harlan Wade's proposal. Now she found herself in a stranger's home, about to take responsibility for 2 orphan children she had never met. What have I done? She whispered to the empty room. Yet as she washed away the dust and tears of the day, changing into her nightgown and brushing out her long blonde hair, Lillian couldn't deny that, for all the uncertainty of her situation, she felt safer than she had in months. Her father's rage had been building, his drinking worsening as the family fortunes declined. The prospect of selling his daughter to the highest bidder had seemed to please him more than it disgusted him. Here, at least, she had been treated with kindness and respect. Blake Easton had offered her shelter and purpose without demanding anything inappropriate in return. Still, as she slipped beneath the quilt, Lillian resolved to learn more about the man who had rescued her. Why had Martha seemed to expect her? And what kind of man took in a complete stranger on faith alone? With these questions circling in her mind, Lillian drifted into a deep, exhausted sleep. Her last conscious thought the memory of strong arms holding her secure as they rode through the darkness. Morning arrived with a shaft of sunlight through the bedroom window and the sound of childish giggles in the hallway. Lillian blinked awake, momentarily disoriented before the previous day's events came rushing back. She sat up quickly, glancing around the unfamiliar room. A soft knock came at her door. "Miss Sullivan," Blake's voice was low, obviously trying not to wake her if she was still asleep. "Breakfast will be ready soon if you're feeling up to joining us." "Yes, thank you," she called back, pushing aside the quilt. "I'll be out shortly." "The girls are eager to meet you," Blake added, his voice warm with affection for his nieces. "But take your time, there's no rush." Lillian heard his footsteps retreating and quickly rose to prepare for the day. She washed at the basin, dressed in her second-best dress, thankfully packed in her carpet bag before her father's ultimatum, and pinned up her hair in a simple but neat style. The face that looked back at her from the small mirror above the washstand was pale but composed. Whatever happened next, she would face it with dignity. When she emerged from her room, the delicious aroma of coffee, bacon, and fresh bread led her to the kitchen, where a scene of domestic warmth greeted her. Blake sat at the table with a small girl perched on his knee, her dark curls bouncing as she animatedly described something involving a frog and what sounded like a considerable amount of mud. Across from them, a slightly older girl with straight brown hair neatly braided into pigtails was carefully setting the table under Martha's watchful eye. The conversation paused as Lillian entered, and 4 pairs of eyes turned toward her. "Good morning," she said, suddenly feeling shy. Blake smiled, the expression softening his weathered features. "Miss Sullivan, allow me to introduce my nieces. This is Sarah," he indicated the small whirlwind on his knee, "and that's Emma," nodding toward the older girl. Emma approached Lillian with a solemn expression that seemed too mature for her 7 years. "How do you do, Miss Sullivan?" she said politely, extending her hand. "Uncle Blake says you're going to help take care of us." Lillian took the child's small hand, touched by her formal greeting. "I am indeed, Emma. I'm very pleased to meet you." Sarah, not to be outdone, scrambled down from Blake's lap and dashed across the room to stand before Lillian, looking up with wide, curious eyes. "Do you know any stories?" she demanded without preamble. "Uncle Blake's stories are mostly about horses and cattle drives, and they don't have enough princesses." Lillian couldn't help but laugh. "I know many stories," she assured the little girl. "Some with princesses, some with brave knights, and some with clever children who outsmart giants and dragons." Sarah's face lit up with delight. "Dragons? Uncle Blake, she knows dragon stories." She turned back to Lillian, her expression suddenly suspicious. "Do the dragons get killed?" "I don't like it when they die. Not all dragons are wicked," Lillian told her seriously. "In some of my stories, they become friends with the heroes." This appeared to satisfy Sarah, who grabbed Lillian's hand and began tugging her toward the table. "You can sit next to me," she announced. "Sarah," Blake admonished gently, "Miss Sullivan might prefer to choose her own seat." Lillian smiled at him over the child's head. "Next to Sarah sounds perfect," she assured him, allowing the little girl to lead her to the table. Breakfast was a lively affair. Martha had prepared a hearty meal of bacon, eggs, fried potatoes, and fresh bread still warm from the oven. The girls, especially Sarah, peppered Lillian with questions about herself, her family, which she deflected as gently as possible, and most importantly, her repertoire of stories. "Perhaps Miss Sullivan could tell you a story before bed tonight," Blake suggested as he poured himself a second cup of coffee. "If she's not too tired," he added, glancing at Lillian with a silent question in his eyes. "I would be happy to," Lillian assured him, warmed by the eager expressions on the girls' faces. After breakfast, Martha shooed the girls off to wash up and get ready for their lessons, which Emma explained were usually conducted by Martha in the mornings. "But maybe you'll teach us now." The older girl asked hopefully. "Martha says you probably know more book learning than she does." "We'll work something out," Lillian promised. "For today, why don't you continue with Martha while I learn my way around?" Once the girls had scampered off, Blake invited Lillian to join him on the porch. The morning was clear and crisp, the vast Wyoming landscape stretching out before them, golden in the autumn sunlight. Mountains rose in the distance, their peaks already dusted with early snow. "I want to thank you again for taking me in," Lillian said as they settled into the wooden rocking chairs that faced the view. "I'm not sure what I would have done otherwise." Blake's expression turned serious. "No one should be cast out by their own family," he said, his voice tight with controlled anger. Especially not for refusing to marry against their will. Lillian glanced at him curiously. You seem to know a great deal about my situation, Mr. Easton. Blake hesitated, then sighed, running a hand through his dark hair. I should be honest with you, Miss Sullivan. I did know something of your circumstances before I found you on that road. Martha let something slip last night, Lillian admitted. She mentioned you had her prepare the room while you were fetching me. Blake nodded, his expression rueful. I was in town yesterday morning at the general store. I overheard your father arguing with Harlan Wade. Your father was intoxicated and making quite a scene. He was telling Wade that he'd handle you, that you'd be ready to accept Wade's proposal by nightfall, or… He paused, clearly uncomfortable, or he'd throw me out, Lillian finished softly, which he did. I know your father's temper, Blake said grimly. I've seen him in town often enough. When I heard him threaten you, he shook his head. I couldn't just do nothing, so I rode out later, thinking I might encounter you on the road if the worst happened. Lillian stared at him, a mixture of emotions washing through her, embarrassment that her family troubles were public knowledge. Anger that her father would speak of her so callously, but mostly a profound gratitude that this man, this stranger, had cared enough to act. You deliberately came looking for me, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Blake met her gaze steadily. I did, and I'd do it again. But why? You didn't even know me. Because it was the right thing to do, he said simply. And because… He hesitated, then continued more slowly, because I've seen what happens to women with no protector in this territory, the choices forced upon them. No one deserves that fate, especially not someone who showed the courage to stand up to a man like Harlan Wade. Lillian's throat tightened with emotion. In a world where women were too often treated as property to be bartered, Blake Easton's respect for her choice, for her autonomy, was a rare gift. Thank you, she said finally. Not just for the rescue, but for your honesty now. Blake nodded, seeming relieved by her reaction. I want you to feel safe here, Miss Sullivan, to know that you have choices. The position with the girls is yours for as long as you want it, but if at any point you wish to move on, I'll help you make arrangements. I appreciate that, Lillian said sincerely. But for now, I'd like to focus on getting to know the girls and finding my place here, if that's agreeable to you. More than agreeable, Blake assured her, a smile warming his eyes. The girls already seem taken with you, especially Sarah. She's not usually so quick to warm up to strangers. They're delightful children, Lillian said, meaning every word, though I suspect they keep you quite busy. Blake chuckled, the sound rich and genuine. That they do. Sarah in particular has a talent for mischief that would impress even the most seasoned troublemaker. His expression turned more serious. They've been through a lot. Rachel and her husband, Daniel, lived about 20 miles from here. When they fell ill, it happened so quickly. I didn't even know they were sick until it was too late. The pain in his voice was evident, and without thinking, Lillian reached over to touch his hand where it rested on the arm of the rocker. I'm so sorry for your loss. Blake looked down at her hand on his, then back to her face. Rachel was my only sibling. We were close, despite the distance. When I brought the girls here, I promised myself I'd give them the best life possible, but a ranch is no place for children without a mother's influence. He sighed. Martha has been wonderful, but she has her own family, her own responsibilities. The girls need someone whose primary concern is them. I understand, Lillian assured him, withdrawing her hand as she realized the impropriety of the gesture, and I promise to do my best by them. They sat in companionable silence for a few minutes, watching as ranch hands moved about the yard, going about their morning tasks. Several men tipped their hats respectfully as they passed the porch, curiosity evident in their glances toward Lillian. Word travels fast on a ranch, Blake said, noting her awareness of the men's interest. By now, everyone knows you're here to help with the girls. They'll be respectful, but don't be surprised if they find excuses to introduce themselves over the next few days. Lillian smiled at the thought. I don't mind. It would be good to learn everyone's names. There are 12 hands working here permanently, Blake explained, plus Frank and Martha, who live in the small house behind the cookhouse. During roundup and branding seasons, we hire on another dozen or so temporary hands. It's a substantial operation, Lillian observed, impressed by the scope of the ranch. Blake nodded. Silver Creek runs about 2,000 head of cattle. We also breed and train horses. That's my particular passion. I was working with horses long before I took over the ranch from my father. As if summoned by their conversation, a magnificent black stallion appeared in the corral near the barn, head high and tail flagged as it trotted the perimeter of the fence. That's Midnight, Blake said, obvious pride in his voice. Finest stallion in the territory. He sired some of the best stock we've ever produced. He's beautiful, Lillian said, genuinely awed by the powerful animal. Would you like to see more of the ranch later? Blake offered. After the midday meal, perhaps, I could show you the stable, introduce you to some of the gentler horses. The girls' love riding. Rachel made sure they were comfortable on horseback from an early age. I'd like that, Lillian agreed, though her own experience with horses was limited. Her father had never seen the value in teaching his daughter to ride properly. Their conversation was interrupted by the appearance of Frank, who approached the porch with a purposeful stride. Blake, he called, rider coming in, looks like young Daniels from the Robertson place. Blake rose immediately, his relaxed demeanor shifting to alertness. Excuse me, Miss Sullivan, he said with a slight bow. Duty calls. Lillian watched as he descended the steps to meet the approaching rider, struck by the way the men of the ranch automatically deferred to him despite his youth. Blake couldn't be much past 30, yet he commanded respect without apparent effort. There was a natural authority to him, tempered by the kindness she had witnessed in his interactions with his nieces and with her. As she observed the exchange between Blake and the young rider, Lillian allowed herself to acknowledge the growing warmth she felt toward her rescuer. Blake Easton was unlike any man she had ever known, thoughtful, principled, and respectful in a way that seemed to come naturally rather than from social convention. But she had to be careful. Her situation was precarious, her position in his household dependent on his goodwill. Allowing herself to develop tender feelings for him would be unwise, perhaps even dangerous to her newfound stability. Better to focus on the girls, on earning her keep, and on building a new life for herself free from her father's control. With that resolution firmly in mind, Lillian rose and returned to the house, determined to make herself useful and to keep her heart carefully guarded against its own inclinations. The next week passed in a blur of new experiences as Lillian settled into life at Silver Creek Ranch. Each day brought fresh discoveries about the ranch, about the girls, and about Blake himself. Emma and Sarah quickly adapted to Lillian's presence in their lives. Emma, serious and thoughtful, approached their relationship with careful consideration. But by the third day, she was seeking Lillian out to share her favorite books and to ask questions about topics that clearly fascinated her agile mind. Sarah, impulsive and affectionate, had accepted Lillian from the first moment, clinging to her new caretaker with a fierce devotion that sometimes brought tears to Lillian's eyes. Martha had been generous in helping Lillian learn her way around the household, sharing the rhythms and routines that kept Silver Creek running smoothly. She'd also taken Lillian aside on the second day to explain that while she would continue to handle the cooking and much of the cleaning, she would be grateful for Lillian to take over the girls' education and care. Blake was hoping you might have a knack for teaching, Martha confided as they hung laundry together on the line behind the house. Emma's bright as a new penny, always asking questions that leave me stumped, and Sarah needs a firm but gentle hand to channel all that energy into learning. Lillian had happily agreed, drawing on her own education more extensive than most young women in the territory received, thanks to her mother's insistence before her passing 5 years earlier to create lessons for the girls. She established a schoolroom in a sunny corner of the house, using books from Blake's surprisingly extensive library and materials Martha helped her gather. Blake himself remained somewhat of an enigma. He was unfailingly polite, even warm in his interactions with Lillian, especially when the girls were present. But she sensed a guardedness in him, a careful distance he maintained when they were alone. He would ask about her day, listen attentively to her accounts of the girl's progress, and then excuse himself to attend to ranch business. Yet Lillian often caught him watching her when he thought she wasn't aware, his blue eyes thoughtful, almost wistful before he would quickly look away, his expression shuddered once more. It was late afternoon on her 8th day at Silver Creek, and Lillian was sitting on a blanket beneath a large cottonwood tree near the house, reading aloud to the girls. Emma was following along in her own copy of the book, while Sarah, predictably, was dividing her attention between the story and a family of ants she had discovered at the edge of the blanket. "Miss Sullivan," Emma interrupted politely, "what does imperative mean?" Lillian smiled at the child's curiosity. "It means absolutely necessary or very important, something that must be done." Emma nodded, absorbing this information with her usual seriousness. "Like how Uncle Blake says it's imperative that we never go near the creek alone." "Exactly right," Lillian confirmed. "That's an excellent example." "Is it imperative that I listen to this story?" Sarah asked hopefully, clearly more interested in her ants than in the adventures of Robinson Crusoe. Lillian laughed. "Perhaps not imperative, but certainly beneficial. Stories help us learn about the world and about people different from ourselves." Sarah wrinkled her nose. "I like your dragon stories better." "We'll have one of those tonight before bed," Lillian promised. "But for now, Uncle Blake." Sarah's sudden shout interrupted her as the child leapt to her feet, waving enthusiastically. Lillian turned to see Blake approaching on horseback, returning from a day spent checking on the herd in the north pasture. He raised a hand in greeting, his face breaking into a smile as Sarah ran to meet him. In one fluid motion, he swung down from his horse and caught the little girl up in his arms, swinging her around as she giggled in delight. Lillian's heart gave a peculiar flutter at the sight. Blake was still in his work clothes, dusty from the trail, his dark hair tousled by the wind and his day-old stubble giving him a rugged appearance that contrasted sharply with his gentle handling of his niece. Emma had risen more sedately but with equal enthusiasm, closing her book carefully before going to greet her uncle. Blake set Sarah down to embrace Emma, listening with genuine interest as the older girl began telling him about their day's lessons. As they approached the blanket, Blake's eyes met Lillian's, and something in his gaze caused her cheeks to warm. "Miss Sullivan," he greeted her, touching the brim of his hat, "I hope these two haven't been running you ragged." "Not at all," Lillian assured him, rising to her feet and brushing out her skirts. "We've had a productive day." Emma's reading has improved remarkably, and Sarah managed to sit through an entire arithmetic lesson without finding an excuse to chase butterflies. Blake chuckled, ruffling Sarah's curls. "That is an accomplishment. Perhaps we should celebrate such diligence with a special treat after supper. Can we have apple pie?" Sarah asked immediately. "Martha said she might make one today. If Martha made pie, then pie it shall be," Blake agreed. He turned to Lillian again. "Will you join us for a ride tomorrow? I thought we might take a picnic up to Wolf Creek Falls. It's about an hour's ride, but the view is worth it, and the girls have been asking to go." "Please say yes, Miss Sullivan," Emma added, her usually reserved demeanor giving way to excitement. "The falls are so beautiful, and there are wildflowers still blooming in the meadow there, even this late in the season." Lillian hesitated only briefly. A day away from the ranch, spent in Blake's company, part of her warned against becoming too comfortable, too attached, but the eager faces of the girls made resistance impossible. "I'd be delighted," she said, rewarded by the girls' cheers and the warm approval in Blake's eyes. "Excellent," he said. "We'll leave after breakfast. I'll have Martha pack us a proper feast." That evening after supper, as promised, Blake produced a perfectly baked apple pie which Martha served with a dollop of fresh cream from the ranch's dairy. As they enjoyed this treat, Blake entertained them with stories of his day, how he'd found a newborn calf that had somehow become separated from its mother, and the elaborate process of reuniting the pair. The mother was frantic, he explained, bellowing and searching everywhere. When we finally brought her to her calf, she started licking it all over, checking that it was unharmed. Animals aren't so different from people in some ways. A mother's love is a powerful thing. Lillian noticed Emma grow quiet at this, her small face suddenly solemn. Blake must have noticed too, for he reached across the table to take his niece's hand. "Your mama loved you and Sarah more than anything in this world," he said gently. "She'd be so proud of the fine young ladies you're becoming." Emma nodded, blinking back tears. "I know, I just wish. I wish I could remember her voice better. Sometimes I can't hear it in my head anymore." Sarah, too young to fully understand her sister's grief, nevertheless scooted her chair closer to Emma's and leaned against her side in wordless comfort. Blake looked momentarily at a loss, pain flashing across his features before he controlled it. "Perhaps," he began, then faltered. "Perhaps," Lillian said softly, stepping into the difficult moment, "we could start a memory book for your mother. We could write down all the stories you remember about her, draw pictures of things she loved, and that way you'll always have something to help you remember." Emma looked up, hope brightening her tear-filled eyes. "Could we really?" "Of course," Lillian assured her. "We can start tomorrow evening when we return from our picnic." "That's a wonderful idea," Blake said, gratitude evident in his voice. "I have some of Rachel's letters and a few photographs we could include." The mood lightened after that, and soon it was time for the girls' bedtime routine. As promised, Lillian told them a story about a friendly dragon who helped a village during a drought by flying to the mountains to bring back rain clouds. By the time she finished, Sarah was already half asleep, and Emma was yawning widely despite her attempts to appear alert. After tucking them in and kissing their foreheads, a gesture that had become natural over the past week, Lillian quietly left their room, closing the door softly behind her. She was surprised to find Blake waiting in the hallway, leaning against the wall with his arms crossed. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for what you said at supper about the memory book." Lillian shook her head. "There's no need to thank me. It seemed like something that might help." "It was perfect," Blake insisted. "I've been trying to find ways to help them hold onto their memories of Rachel and Daniel, but I'm not always good at knowing what they need." "You're better than you give yourself credit for," Lillian told him sincerely. "The girls adore you. It's clear in everything they do and say." Blake's expression softened. "They're easy to adore in return." He hesitated, then asked, "Would you care to join me on the porch for a while? The night's clear and the stars are something to behold." Lillian knew she should decline. Their growing closeness was dangerous territory. Yet she found herself nodding. "I'd like that." The night air was cool but not uncomfortable as they settled into the rocking chairs on the porch. Above them, the Wyoming sky was a vast canvas of stars, more brilliant than Lillian had ever seen them. "It's breathtaking," she murmured, her head tilted back to take in the spectacle. "It is," Blake agreed, though when she glanced over, she found him looking at her rather than the sky. He quickly averted his gaze when their eyes met. "My father used to say that a man could feel properly small under a Wyoming night sky, just significant enough to matter in the grand scheme of things, but humble enough to remember he's not the center of it all." "Your father sounds like a wise man," Lillian observed. "He was," Blake agreed. "Tough but fair, he built this place from nothing, taught me everything I know about ranching and about being a man of principle." He paused, his expression distant with memory. "He would have liked you." The simple statement caught Lillian off guard. "Why do you say that?" Blake smiled, his face silvered by the moonlight. He valued courage above most other qualities, said you could teach a person almost anything, but courage had to come from within. His voice softened. "What you did refusing Wade despite knowing the consequences that took real courage." Lillian shook her head slightly. "It didn't feel like courage at the time, it felt like desperation." "Sometimes they're the same thing," Blake said. "Facing impossible choices forces us to discover what we're made of." He looked out across the dark landscape. "When Rachel died, I was terrified of raising the girls alone. I'd never been responsible for children before, but there was no one else and they needed me, so I did it anyway despite the fear." "And you've done wonderfully," Lillian assured him. "They're happy here, safe." Blake turned to her, his expression suddenly vulnerable in a way she hadn't seen before. "Are you happy here, I mean?" The question hung between them, weighted with meaning beyond the simple words. Lillian knew her answer mattered perhaps more than it should. "Yes," she said softly. Happier than I've been in a very long time. Something shifted in Blake's expression, a tension easing. I'm glad, he said simply. They sat in companionable silence after that, the gentle creaking of the rocking chairs and the distant sounds of night, creatures the only accompaniment to their thoughts. When the cool air finally drove them inside, Blake walked Lillian to her door, pausing awkwardly as if wanting to say more but thinking better of it. "Good night, Lillian," he said finally, her given name spoken so softly it might have been a slip. "Good night, Blake," she replied, matching his informality with a small smile. As she prepared for bed, Lillian acknowledged the truth she had been trying to deny. She was developing feelings for Blake Easton, feelings that went far beyond gratitude or respect. And unless she was badly mistaken, he was struggling with similar feelings for her. The realization should have alarmed her more than it did. Her position in his household was precarious. She had no family to stand behind her, no resources of her own. If her growing attachment to Blake became known and was not reciprocated, or worse, if he were to take advantage of it, her situation could become untenable. Yet, as she drifted toward sleep, Lillian couldn't bring herself to regret the warmth that bloomed in her chest when she thought of him. For the first time in her life, she had met a man whose character she genuinely admired, whose company she truly enjoyed. Whatever came of these feelings, they were honest, and she would not dishonor them with fear. The morning dawned clear and promising for their expedition to Wolf Creek Falls. Martha outdid herself preparing a picnic basket brimming with fried chicken, biscuits, preserves, apple tarts, and a jug of fresh lemonade. Blake had saddled 4 horses, his own stallion Thunder, gentle mares for the girls, and a docile gelding named Copper for Lillian. "He's steady as they come," Blake assured her as he helped her mount, his hands strong and sure at her waist. "He'll follow the others with minimal guidance, but if you're comfortable, you can use the reins to direct him." Lillian nodded, settling herself in the saddle and adjusting her skirts. She was wearing her sturdiest dress for the ride, and Blake had provided a pair of leather gloves that had belonged to his sister, explaining they would protect her hands from the reins. The girls were already mounted, Emma sitting tall and confident on her pony, while Sarah bounced with excitement on hers, eager to be underway. "Remember the rules," Blake reminded them as he swung up onto Thunder. "Stay where I can see you, no racing, and listen for my signals." "Yes, Uncle Blake," they chorused, their responses so practiced that Lillian suspected this reminder preceded every ride. They set off at an easy pace, the girls riding just ahead while Blake stayed alongside Lillian, occasionally offering quiet suggestions to improve her seat or her handling of the reins. The morning was gloriously clear, the autumn sun warm without being hot, and a gentle breeze carrying the scent of pine and sage. "You're a natural," Blake observed after they'd been riding for half an hour. "Are you sure you haven't had much experience with horses?" Lillian smiled, pleased by the compliment. "My father didn't think riding was an appropriate accomplishment for a young lady. He preferred I focus on more domestic skills." Blake's expression darkened slightly at the mention of her father, but he kept his tone light. "Well, his loss is our gain." The girls love riding, and now they'll have another companion to join them. They rode through rolling grassland that gradually gave way to more wooded terrain as they approached the foothills. The trail began to climb, winding through stands of aspen and pine. Occasionally, Blake would point out wildlife, a red-tailed hawk circling overhead, a group of mule deer watching warily from a distance, a fox slipping silently through the underbrush. "There it is," Emma called suddenly, pointing ahead to where the sound of rushing water could now be heard. "Wolf Creek Falls?" They emerged from the trees into a picturesque clearing where a stream cascaded over a series of rocky ledges, creating a waterfall perhaps 30 feet high. The pool at its base was clear as glass, reflecting the surrounding trees and the blue sky above. Wildflowers still bloomed in patches throughout the meadow, adding splashes of purple, yellow, and white to the autumn palette. "It's beautiful," Lillian breathed, taking in the scene. Blake smiled at her reaction. "One of my favorite places on Silver Creek land." My father brought me here when I was no older than Emma. They dismounted at the edge of the clearing, Blake helping Lillian down from her horse with a touch that lingered perhaps a moment longer than necessary. The girls immediately ran toward the pool, though they stopped a respectful distance from the edge, clearly accustomed to Blake's safety rules. Blake tethered the horses where they could graze on the meadow grass, then carried the picnic basket to a flat, grassy area with a good view of the falls. Lillian helped him spread the blanket Martha had provided, arranging the food while the girls explored nearby, collecting wildflowers and interesting stones. They seem so free here, Lillian observed, watching as Sarah attempted to teach Emma how to make a daisy chain. So different from town children, Blake nodded, pride evident in his expression as he watched his nieces. Rachel and I grew up the same way with room to run and explore. When she married Daniel and moved to his place, she made sure the girls had the same freedom. She would have hated to see them cooped up in town, always worried about getting their dresses dirty or being too loud. You've honored her wishes beautifully, Lillian told him. They're thriving here. Blake's gaze shifted to her, something warm and appreciative in his eyes. They're thriving even more since you arrived. You've been good for them, Lillian, better than I could have hoped. The use of her given name, so natural now when they were alone, sent a pleasant warmth through her. They're remarkable children, she said sincerely. It's easy to care for them. Still, Blake insisted, what you've brought to Silver Creek, it's made a difference to them and… He hesitated, then finished softly, to me. Before Lillian could respond to this admission, Sarah came running up, her hands full of wildflowers. Miss Sullivan, Uncle Blake, look what I found. The moment passed as they admired Sarah's treasures and called Emma to join them for the picnic. The meal was a merry affair, with the girls' appetites sharpened by the ride and the mountain air. They ate until they couldn't manage another bite, then sprawled on the blanket, content and drowsy in the warm sunlight. Can we wade in the pool, Uncle Blake? Emma asked eventually, sitting up and looking hopefully toward the water. Just at the edge, Blake agreed after a moment's consideration. The water's likely cold, and the current is strong closer to the falls. The girls didn't need to be told twice. They quickly removed their boots and stockings and rolled up their skirts, racing to the shallow edge of the pool where they squealed at the cold water but stubbornly continued their wading. Blake watched them for a moment, then turned to Lillian with a slight smile. Would you care to see the falls from closer up? There's a path that leads behind them. It's relatively easy going, and the view is worth the effort. Lillian hesitated only briefly before nodding. I'd like that. Blake offered his hand to help her up, and to her surprise, he didn't release it as they began walking toward the falls. The simple contact of his calloused palm against hers sent a current of awareness through her that had nothing to do with the cool spray now misting their faces as they approached the waterfall. Girls, we're going to look at the falls from the path, Blake called. Stay where you are and don't go any deeper. Yes, Uncle Blake, they responded in unison, too engrossed in their water play to be interested in accompanying the adults. The path Blake led her to was narrow but well-defined, winding up and behind the falls where a natural ledge created a sheltered space. The roar of the water was louder here, but not so overwhelming that they couldn't speak. Look, Blake said, gesturing out through the curtain of falling water. The view was indeed spectacular. The water created a shimmering veil through which the meadow, the horses, and the girls appeared as if in a dream, colors intensified, movements fluid and graceful. I've never seen anything like it, Lillian said honestly, enchanted by the play of light and water. Few people know about this spot, Blake told her, his voice close to her ear to be heard over the falls. My father showed it to me, saying it was where he proposed to my mother. Lillian turned to look at him, suddenly aware of the intimacy of their position, the narrow ledge necessitating that they stand close together, the secluded nature of the spot, the romantic history Blake had just revealed. It's a perfect place for such a moment, she said softly, her heart beginning to race as Blake's eyes held hers. Yes, he agreed, his gaze dropping briefly to her lips before returning to her eyes. Lillian, Whatever he had been about to say was cut off by a piercing scream from the meadow. They both reacted instantly, hurrying back down the path with Blake in the lead, his hand gripping Lillian's firmly to ensure she didn't slip on the wet rocks. They emerged from behind the falls to find Sarah standing at the edge of the pool, pointing frantically toward Emma, who had somehow ended up in deeper water and was struggling against the current pulling her toward the base of the falls. Blake didn't hesitate. He released Lillian's hand and dove into the pool, powerful strokes carrying him swiftly to Emma. Lillian rushed to Sarah, grabbing the frightened child and holding her close as they watched Blake reach Emma, wrapping one arm around her while using the other to swim against the current. "It's all right," Lillian soothed, though her own heart was pounding with fear. "Your uncle has her, he'll bring her back safely." Sure enough, Blake was making steady progress back toward the shallows, his strength evident in the way he managed the current while keeping Emma's head well above water. When they reached a point where he could stand, he lifted Emma into his arms, carrying her the rest of the way to shore. "Emma." Sarah broke free from Lillian and ran to her sister as Blake set the older girl down on the grassy bank. Emma was pale and shaking, her dress soaked through but otherwise appeared unharmed. "I'm sorry," she stammered, teeth chattering from the cold water. "I just wanted to see if I could touch the bottom in the deeper part." Blake knelt before her, his own clothes dripping, and took her face gently between his hands. "Emma, you scared years off my life," he said, his voice firm but without anger. "You know the rules about water." "I know," Emma whispered, tears welling in her eyes. "I'm sorry, Uncle Blake." "I won't do it again." Blake pulled her into a tight hug, his relief evident in the way he held her. "See that you don't. I couldn't bear to lose you." Over Emma's head, his eyes met Lillian's, and she saw in them the raw fear he wasn't showing his niece, the terrifying knowledge of how quickly things could have gone wrong. "Let's get you dry and warm," Lillian said practically, moving forward to help. She removed her shawl and wrapped it around Emma's shoulders. "Blake, there's a spare blanket in the basket, isn't there?" Blake nodded, releasing Emma to retrieve it. "We should head back soon," he said. "Both Emma and I need dry clothes, and the sun will be starting its descent before long." The mood was subdued as they packed up the remains of their picnic. Emma was quiet, still shaken by her close call, while Sarah stayed unusually close to her sister, as if afraid she might disappear. Blake was alert and efficient, his earlier relaxed demeanor replaced by a vigilance that spoke of a man who had just been reminded of the precarious nature of happiness. The ride back to the ranch was uneventful, though they traveled more slowly due to Emma's condition. Blake had wrapped her in the spare blanket, creating a makeshift poncho that kept her reasonably warm despite her wet clothes. He rode closer to her than on the journey out, his eyes rarely leaving her small form. By the time they reached Silver Creek, the sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows across the yard. Martha emerged from the house as they rode in, her expression changing from welcome to concern as she took in their appearance. "Land's sake, what happened?" she exclaimed, hurrying forward as Blake lifted Emma down from her pony. "A mishap at the pool," Blake explained briefly. "Emma needs a hot bath and dry clothes right away." Martha didn't need to be told twice. She whisked Emma into the house, already calling for hot water to be brought to the bathing room. Sarah trailed after them, still unwilling to be separated from her sister. Blake handed the horses over to a ranch hand who had come to assist, then turned to Lillian. "I should change as well," he said, gesturing to his still damp clothing. "Would you mind checking on the girls once you've settled?" "Of course," Lillian assured him. "I'll make sure they're both all right." Blake nodded gratefully, then hesitated as if wanting to say more. Instead, he simply touched her arm briefly before heading into the house. That evening, after the excitement had settled and the girls were tucked safely in bed, Lillian sat alone in the parlor, a book open on her lap, though she wasn't reading it. Her mind kept returning to the moment behind the falls, the look in Blake's eyes, the words he'd been about to speak before Emma's cry interrupted them. She was so lost in thought that she didn't hear Blake enter the room until he spoke. "Penny, for your thoughts." Lillian looked up, startled to find him standing in the doorway, freshly shaven and dressed in clean clothes, his hair still damp from washing. "I was just reflecting on the day," she said honestly, closing her book. Blake crossed the room to sit in the chair opposite hers, his expression somber. "It didn't end as I'd planned. Emma is safe," Lillian reminded him gently. "That's what matters." "Yes," he agreed, running a hand through his hair in a gesture she'd come to recognize as a sign of his agitation. "But it could have ended very differently, if Sarah hadn't called out when she did, if I hadn't reached Emma in time." He shook his head, unable to complete the thought. "But none of that happened," Lillian said firmly. "You were there, you saved her." Blake's eyes met hers, vulnerability clear in their depths. "When Rachel and Daniel died, I promised myself I would keep the girls safe. Today reminded me how quickly that promise can be broken through no fault of my own." He sighed deeply. "The world is full of dangers, Lillian. I can't protect them from everything, no matter how much I want to." Lillian rose from her chair and moved to sit beside him on the small sofa, taking his hand in both of hers. "No one can," she said softly, "not even the most loving parent or guardian. All we can do is teach them, guide them, and be there to catch them when they fall." Blake looked down at their joined hands, then back to her face. "We," he repeated, a question in his voice. Lillian felt heat rise to her cheeks, realizing the presumption in her words. "I only meant, that is. I care for the girls too. I want to help them grow into strong, capable women." "I know you do," Blake said, his voice warm, "and they're flourishing under your care." He paused, then added more quietly, as is Silver Creek, "As am I." The admission hung between them, honest and unadorned. "Blake," Lillian began, uncertain of what she wanted to say, but feeling that something important was happening between them. "Behind the falls today," Blake interrupted, his grip on her hand tightening slightly. "Before we heard Sarah's scream, I was about to tell you something." Lillian's heart quickened. "Yes, I was going to tell you that you've brought light back to Silver Creek," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "That in the short time you've been here, you've become essential to this place, to the girls." He paused, then finished, "to me." Lillian's breath caught in her throat. "Blake, you don't need to say anything," he assured her quickly. "I know your position here is complicated. I know you came here out of necessity, not choice. I wouldn't presume to think that your feelings match mine. But after today, after seeing how fragile life can be, I couldn't let another day pass without telling you what's in my heart." Lillian stared at him, momentarily speechless at the openness of his declaration. Then, gathering her courage, she replied, "My coming to Silver Creek may have been circumstance, but my staying is very much by choice. These past days have been. I've never felt so at home, so valued for who I am rather than what I can provide." She took a deep breath. "The girls have captured my heart, and so have you, Blake Easton." The hope that bloomed in Blake's eyes was like sunrise over the mountains, gradual at first, then suddenly brilliant. "Lillian," he breathed, lifting one hand to cup her cheek gently. She leaned into his touch, her eyes fluttering closed briefly at the tenderness of the gesture. When she opened them again, Blake was closer, his intent clear in his expression. "May I?" he asked softly, his gaze dropping to her lips. In answer, Lillian closed the distance between them, pressing her lips to his in a kiss that began tentatively but quickly deepened as Blake's arms encircled her waist, drawing her closer. His lips were warm and surprisingly soft against hers, his embrace secure without being confining. When they finally parted, both slightly breathless, Blake rested his forehead against hers. "I've wanted to do that since the moment I saw you on that road," he admitted. Lillian smiled, her heart lighter than it had been in years. "Even with dirt on my face and tears in my eyes." "Especially then," Blake assured her. "You looked like a warrior princess from one of Sarah's stories, proud and fierce despite everything." Lillian laughed softly at the comparison. "Hardly that, I was terrified. Yet you stood your ground against your father, against Wade," Blake reminded her. "That took courage, Lillian, the kind of courage I've always admired most." He brushed a strand of hair from her face, his expression growing more serious. "I want you to know that this changes nothing about your position here unless you wish it to. The girls need you, and I would never want you to feel pressured or obligated." "I don't." Lillian assured him, touched by his concern. "What I feel for you, for the girls, for Silver Creek, it's freely given." Blake smiled, relief evident in his expression. "Then perhaps, with time, we might see where this leads. I'm not a man to rush into things, Lillian, especially not with the girls to consider. But I'd like the chance to court you properly, if you're willing." Lillian's heart swelled at the honorable nature of his proposal. No demands, no presumptions, just an honest request for the opportunity to explore their growing feelings in a way that respected her independence and the well-being of his nieces. "I'd like that very much," she said softly. Blake's smile was radiant as he leaned in to kiss her once more, a gentle promise of things to come. The weeks that followed were among the happiest of Lillian's life. Blake courted her with a thoughtfulness that revealed the depth of his character, small gestures like wildflowers left on her desk. Thoughtful conversations on the porch after the girls were asleep, rides together when ranch duties permitted. He was never presumptuous, always respectful of her position in his household, yet increasingly open about his growing feelings for her. The girls, far from being confused by the shifting relationship between their uncle and their caretaker, seemed to blossom in the warmth of their developing affection. Sarah took to calling Lillian Lily in moments of particular closeness, while Emma sought her out for private conversations about her mother, finding in Lillian a safe confidante for her grief and memories. Together, they created the memory book Lillian had suggested, filling it with Rachel's letters, sketches of the girls, pressed flowers from her favorite spots on the ranch, and stories that Emma and Sarah recalled about their parents. Blake contributed photographs and his own memories of his sister, often staying up late into the night with Lillian after the girls were asleep, reminiscing about Rachel in a way that seemed to ease his own grief. As October gave way to November, the ranch prepared for winter. Cattle were moved to sheltered pastures, hay was stored in the barns, and the house was made snug against the coming cold. Lillian threw herself into these preparations, learning from Martha how to preserve the last of the garden's bounty and helping Blake inventory supplies to ensure they would be well stocked when snow made travel to town difficult. It was during this time that Blake first broached the subject of Christmas. They were in the barn together, Lillian holding a lantern while Blake checked the tack that would need to see them through winter. "The girls' first Christmas without Rachel and Daniel was last year," he explained, his hands working efficiently at oiling a bridle. "It was difficult. I did my best, but everything was still so raw. This year I was hoping it might be different," Lillian understood immediately. "You want to make it special for them?" Blake nodded, his expression earnest. Rachel always made Christmas magical. There were traditions decorating the house with pine boughs and berries, baking special cookies, singing carols around the piano. "I tried last year, but—" He shrugged, a rueful smile tugging at his lips. "I'm not much of a baker, and my singing would frighten the livestock." Lillian laughed, warmed by his willingness to admit his limitations. "I'd be happy to help," she assured him. "My mother had our own Christmas traditions. Perhaps we could combine them with Rachel's, create something that honors their memories while making new traditions of our own." The gratitude in Blake's eyes was reward enough, but when he set aside the bridle to take her in his arms and kiss her thoroughly, Lillian found herself thinking that Christmas at Silver Creek might be magical indeed. As November progressed, however, an unexpected complication arose. Lillian was in Murphy's with Martha, purchasing supplies before the first heavy snow, when she quite literally collided with her father outside the general store. "Lillian," he said, his voice slurring slightly in a way that told her he'd already visited the saloon that morning. "So you did run to Easton after all." Lillian stiffened, stepping back from him as Martha moved protectively to her side. "Good morning, Father," she said calmly, determined not to show her distress. "I hope you are well." "Well," he scoffed, his weathered face twisted with bitterness. "My own daughter disgraces herself, runs off to live with a man not her husband, and you ask if I'm well." "That's quite enough, Jacob Sullivan," Martha said firmly, drawing herself up to her full height. Miss Lillian is employed at Silver Creek Ranch as governess to Blake's nieces, a position she fills with great respectability. There's no call for such insinuations. Governess, her father sneered. Is that what they're calling it now? Harlan Wade was willing to marry her proper, give her a decent name, and she throws it away to be Easton's father. Lillian interrupted sharply, her cheeks burning with anger rather than shame. You will not speak that way about Mr. Easton. He has shown me nothing but respect, which is more than I can say for you or Mr. Wade. A small crowd had begun to gather, drawn by the confrontation. Among them, Lillian noticed the town's minister, Reverend Collins, watching with concern. Her father noticed too. Ask the Reverend what he thinks of your situation, he challenged. Living under the roof of an unmarried man, no proper chaperone. That's nonsense and you know it, Martha interjected. Frank and I live right there on the property. The situation is entirely proper. But Lillian could see the damage being done. The townsfolk were watching, listening, forming judgments. No matter how innocent her relationship with Blake had been, and it had been, despite their growing feelings, her reputation was now tarnished in the eyes of Murphys. Come, Martha, she said quietly, we should finish our errands. As they turned to go, her father called after her, Wade's still interested, you know. Told me to let you know his offer stands, said he'd overlook your indiscretion if you came back and agreed to marry him. Lillian didn't dignify this with a response, continuing on with Martha toward the dressmaker's shop where they had planned to purchase fabric for new winter clothes for the girls. Don't you fret about him, Martha said once they were inside, patting Lillian's hand comfortingly. Everyone knows Jacob Sullivan's a mean drunk with more spite than sense. But what he said about how people would view my position at Silver Creek. Lillian couldn't help but worry. She had built a new life for herself, found happiness she hadn't thought possible. The idea that it could be threatened by malicious gossip was deeply unsettling. Martha's expression was sympathetic but realistic. People will talk, she acknowledged. It's the way of small towns, but those who matter know the truth. Lillian nodded, trying to take comfort in Martha's words. But as they completed their shopping and prepared to return to the ranch, she couldn't shake the feeling that something precious was now vulnerable in a way it hadn't been before. Blake noticed her subdued mood the moment they returned. He helped unload the wagon, his eyes often seeking hers with silent questions she wasn't ready to answer. It wasn't until after supper, when the girls were occupied with a game of checkers by the fire, that he drew her aside to the kitchen. What happened in town? He asked directly, his concern evident. Martha's been giving me looks all afternoon, and you've barely said a word since you got back, Lillian sighed, knowing she couldn't shield him from this. I encountered my father, she admitted. He was unpleasant, made insinuations about my position here. Blake's expression darkened. What kind of insinuations? The kind you would expect from a bitter man who feels his authority has been challenged, Lillian said, trying to soften the ugly scene. It doesn't matter. I know the truth of my situation here. It matters if he's spreading lies that hurt you, Blake insisted, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. I won't have your name dragged through the mud, Lillian. It's not just my name at stake, she pointed out gently. Your reputation in the community matters too, especially for the girls' sake. If people believe there's something improper about my presence here. Blake's expression shifted from anger to something more resolute. Then we give them no reason to believe it, he said firmly. When Lillian looked at him questioningly, he continued, Lillian, I've been thinking about this for weeks now. Today's incident just makes it more urgent. He took her hands in his blue eyes serious. I love you. I think I've loved you since I found you on that road, standing tall despite everything you'd lost. I love the way you care for the girls, the way you've brought light and laughter back to this house. I love your courage, your kindness, your strength. Lillian's breath caught in her throat. They had been growing closer, their feelings developing naturally over the weeks, but neither had spoken the word love until this moment. I had planned to wait until Christmas, Blake continued, to make it special, but I don't want to wait anymore. Not when your happiness, your reputation is at stake. He squeezed her hands gently. "Lillian Sullivan, would you do me the great honor of becoming my wife?" Joy burst through Lillian like sunlight through clouds. "Yes," she whispered, tears of happiness welling in her eyes. "Yes, Blake, I love you too, so much." Blake's face broke into a radiant smile and he pulled her into his arms, lifting her slightly off her feet as he embraced her. When he set her down, he cradled her face in his hands and kissed her with a tenderness that spoke volumes about his feelings. A small gasp from the doorway broke them apart. Emma stood there, eyes wide, with Sarah peeking around her sister with an enormous grin. "Are you going to marry Uncle Blake?" Sarah asked eagerly, bouncing on her toes. Lillian and Blake exchanged a glance, his expression asking a silent question. Lillian nodded and Blake turned to his nieces. "Yes, if that's all right with you too," he said, his tone serious despite the joy in his eyes. "Miss Sullivan has agreed to become my wife, which means she would also become your aunt. How would you feel about that?" Emma approached slowly, her expression thoughtful. "Would you stay here forever?" she asked Lillian. "You wouldn't leave like Mama did." Lillian's heart ached at the fear underlying the question. She knelt down to be at eye level with the child. "I can't promise that nothing will ever happen to me, Emma," she said honestly. "But I can promise that I would never choose to leave you. I love you and Sarah very much, and I love your Uncle Blake. I want us to be a family together." Emma considered this, her young face solemn. Then she nodded once, decisively. "Then I think it's a very good idea." Sarah, less restrained in her enthusiasm, launched herself at Lillian with a squeal of delight. "Does this mean I can call you Aunt Lily all the time now?" Lillian laughed, hugging the little girl tightly. "Yes, sweetheart, you can." Blake joined them on the floor, gathering Emma into his arms as well, the four of them creating an impromptu family circle in the middle of the kitchen. "It seems we're all in agreement then," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "We'll be married as soon as it can be arranged. Before Christmas?" Sarah asked hopefully. Blake glanced at Lillian, eyebrows raised in question. "That would be my preference," he admitted. "Though I understand if you'd like more time to prepare." Lillian shook her head, smiling through happy tears. "Before Christmas sounds perfect. I can think of no better gift for all of us." The next day, Blake rode into town alone, returning with news that Reverend Collins had agreed to perform the ceremony on the first Saturday in December, just 3 weeks away. He also brought a simple but beautiful engagement ring of sapphire surrounded by tiny diamonds that had belonged to his mother. "Dad gave this to her right behind Wolf Creek Falls," Blake explained, as he slipped it onto Lillian's finger that evening. "It seems fitting that it should come to you." The preparations for the wedding became intertwined with those for Christmas, creating an atmosphere of joyous anticipation at Silver Creek. Word spread quickly through the community, and to Lillian's relief, the legitimate engagement seemed to quell most of the gossip her father had attempted to stir. Martha and several of the neighboring ranch wives rallied around Lillian, helping her prepare a wedding dress from fine fabric Blake had specially ordered from Cheyenne. The women of the community, many of whom had known Blake since childhood, welcomed Lillian warmly, their initial reservations about the newcomer dissolving in the face of her obvious devotion to Blake and the girls. Even Lillian's father, when faced with the reality that his daughter would soon be mistress of one of the most prosperous ranches in the territory, modified his public stance. While he made no direct overture of reconciliation, he ceased his slander and, through an intermediary, indicated he would not oppose the match. The wedding day dawned clear and cold, the kind of Wyoming winter morning where the sky was so blue it almost hurt to look at it. Lillian stood at her bedroom window, watching as ranch hands and neighbors arrived for the ceremony, which would take place in the large main room of the house. A knock at her door revealed Martha, her round face beaming with maternal pride. "It's nearly time, my dear. Are you ready?" Lillian nodded, smoothing her hands over the ivory silk of her wedding gown. "I've never been more ready for anything in my life." Martha helped her with the final adjustments to her veil, then stood back to admire the effect. "You look beautiful," she said, blinking back tears. "Blake won't know what hit him." Emma and Sarah appeared in the doorway, dressed in matching blue dresses that brought out the color of their eyes the same shade of blue as their uncle's. They would walk ahead of Lillian, scattering dried rose petals that Martha had saved from her garden. "You look like a princess," Sarah breathed, eyes wide with admiration. "The most beautiful princess ever," Emma agreed, her usual reserve melting in the excitement of the day. Frank Thorpe would escort Lillian in the absence of her father, a role he had accepted with quiet pride when Blake asked him. He arrived to collect the bridal party, his weather-beaten face unusually soft as he offered Lillian his arm. "Blake's waiting," he said simply. "And I don't think I've ever seen a man more eager to be married." The ceremony itself passed in a blur of emotion for Lillian. She remembered the hush that fell over the gathered friends and neighbors as she entered the room. She remembered the look of absolute wonder on Blake's face when he saw her, as if he couldn't quite believe his good fortune. She remembered the warmth of his hands as he took hers, the steady conviction in his voice as he spoke his vows, the press of the simple gold band as he slid it onto her finger alongside her engagement ring. Most of all, she remembered the moment when Reverend Collins pronounced them husband and wife, and Blake kissed her with such tender reverence that several of the women in attendance dabbed at their eyes. The celebration that followed was everything a Western wedding should be: abundant food prepared by Martha and the neighboring women, music from a fiddle player Blake had hired from town, dancing that continued well into the evening. The girls delighted in being the center of attention alongside the newlyweds, accepting congratulations on their new aunt with gracious dignity, Emma, and exuberant enthusiasm, Sarah. As the night drew to a close and the last guests departed, Blake took Lillian's hand and led her out onto the porch. The winter stars blazed overhead and their breath formed clouds in the cold air. "Happy?" he asked, drawing her into the circle of his arms. "Completely," she assured him, resting her head against his chest. "I never imagined such happiness was possible." "Nor I," Blake admitted, pressing a kiss to her hair. "After Rachel died, I thought my responsibility was to the girls, to the ranch. I didn't think there was room for more." He tilted her face up to his. "You proved me wrong. You showed me that love doesn't divide; when shared it multiplies. A wise man once told me that they may not want you, but I do," Lillian reminded him, smiling at the memory of their first meeting. "I believe he was right." Blake laughed softly. "The wisest thing I've ever said, though I had no idea then how completely you would change my life." He kissed her then, a kiss full of promise for their future together. When they parted, Lillian looked back at the house, warm light spilling from the windows, the girls safely asleep upstairs, the remnants of their wedding celebration still evident in the decorations that would now transition to Christmas adornments. "Shall we go in, Mrs. Easton?" Blake asked, offering his arm with a formal bow that made her laugh. "Yes, Mr. Easton," she replied, taking his arm. "Let's go home." 5 years later, Lillian sat on the same porch, watching as Blake taught their 3-year-old son, James, to sit on a gentle pony. Emma, now 12, was helping, her patient nature perfect for instructing her young brother. Sarah, 10 and still full of energy, was demonstrating how to hold the reins with excessive flourishes that made James giggle. The years had brought changes to Silver Creek. The ranch had prospered under Blake's continued management, expanding its operations to include a successful horse breeding program that was becoming known throughout the territory. The house had grown too, with additions to accommodate their growing family, not just James, but also 1-year-old Catherine, currently napping inside under Martha's watchful eye. The girls had thrived with Lillian as their aunt and then mother. Emma was developing into a thoughtful young woman with a talent for art that Blake encouraged, while Sarah's exuberance had channeled into a remarkable aptitude for horsemanship that made her uncle endlessly proud. Lillian's father had passed away 2 years earlier, a lonely man estranged from his only child despite her attempts at reconciliation. She had mourned what might have been but found comfort in the family. She and Blake had created a family built on love, respect, and the kind of courage that allowed them to open their hearts to each other despite past wounds. As she watched her husband lift their son from the pony and swing him high in the air, his laughter joining the boys, Lillian reflected on the journey that had brought her here. From that desperate moment on the road outside Murphy's to this abundant life at Silver Creek, it had all begun with a man who looked beyond her circumstances to see her worth, who had said with simple honesty, "They may not want you, but I do." Blake looked up then, catching her eye across the yard. His smile, still as warm and genuine as the day she met him, spoke volumes about the life they had built together. With a word to Emma, he handed James over to his niece and crossed to the porch, taking the seat beside Lillian and reaching for her hand. "What are you thinking about so seriously?" he asked, his thumb tracing gentle circles on her palm. "About how fortunate I am," Lillian replied, leaning against his shoulder. "About how a moment of despair turned into a lifetime of joy." Blake pressed a kiss to her temple. "I'm the fortunate one," he countered. "Every day I thank God that I found you on that road." "Found me?" Lillian teased, glancing up at him. "As I recall, you went looking for me quite deliberately, Mr. Easton. Best decision I ever made," Blake said without a trace of hesitation. "That and asking you to marry me." "I think I can agree with that assessment," Lillian said, smiling as James broke free from Emma's supervision to run toward them, his small face alight with excitement about his riding lesson. As Blake scooped up their son, settling him between them on the porch swing, Lillian looked out at the vista before them, the thriving ranch, the mountains in the distance, the family they had forged together. From cast-out daughter to beloved wife and mother, her journey had been one of redemption through love, the kind of love that saw beyond circumstance to the heart beneath, the kind that said, with both words and actions, "They may not want you, but I do." And in that love, Lillian had found not just a home, but her truest self cherished, respected, and free to give the same to others in return. There could be no greater blessing than that.